Well, welcome. Kaboom, kapow. It's 6 o'clock on Wednesday. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of Live with Littlewood with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. We've got a lot to get through in the next hour. Coming up later on tonight's show, I'll be joined by former member of the European Parliament and now member of the House of Lords, Baroness Claire Fox. From the IA home team, Victoria Hewson, our Head of Regulatory Affairs, and the founder of the CIEO think tank, Joanna Williams. They'll be helping us discuss some of the burning issues of the week. Coming up later, will the new Office for Health Promotion and Lifestyle Paternalism really give us an edge in the next pandemic? After that, we'll also be looking at the state of UK regulation and what the future has in store for red tape. And finally, we're going to touch on the controversy of the Batley grammar school row. What can teachers show to their pupils and not, and what should the consequences be of inappropriate or apparently offensive behaviour? But before all of that, I'm pleased to welcome my first guest to the show. A very, very warm welcome to Daniel Lacalle, joining us from Madrid. Daniel, how are you, sir? Lovely to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
And a very warm welcome and a return to my good friend, Alex Deane. Alex, how are you, sir?
Great, Mark. Great to be back with you. Thank you very much.
So let's start. I want to start with this news that 24 world leaders, including Boris Johnson, Macron, Merkel, have co-written this suggestion that the world now needs a new treaty to build cross-border cooperation to prepare for the next big health crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic, we're told, is the biggest challenge to the global community since the 1940s. I get a bit skeptical about these somewhat hyped up things. I mean, I think the Cold War and the threat of mutually assured destruction at the touch of a button was probably a bigger threat to us than COVID, however bleak COVID has been. But Alex, can I start with you? I mean, especially for sort of free market, liberal-minded people, it's a bit awkward for us to talk about what big governments and big states should be doing because we analyse most of the problems as the state getting in the way of things and blocking things. But what do you think the lessons are here? Pandemics and COVID, I mean, they don't respect borders. Do we need a new treaty? Do we need better international cooperation to try and thwart such threats in the future or to mitigate them better? Or is this just yet another government scheme?
Well, let's begin by agreeing that Merkel and Macron should definitely change course from the one they took with the last pandemic, which didn't work out well at all. So I welcome their willingness to learn lessons. And furthermore, let's be generous and fair and say intention, good. You know, desire to tackle pandemics, desire to be better prepared for them, intention, good. Proposed solution, questionable, and risk, potentially significant. And the risk that I'd identify is the risk of stifling innovation and trying to build things in blocks which will mimic the European Union's failed attempt to respond to coronavirus. If what they're going to do is build a system like the system that so singularly failed millions of people on the European continent, then it would be disastrous. And that's the risk that I'd identify here.
And isn't that baked in there already, Alex? I mean, these are going to be big government solutions. Big governments go around blundering. I mean, would a sleek, efficient international governmental approach even begin to look like?
So I can think of ways that you might be able to be better prepared without having that stymieing, stultifying effect on innovation. And it would, broadly speaking, consist of large amounts of money spent speculatively on fixes for diseases and conditions we're not quite sure are going to be a problem yet, but we'd rather be on the safe side. And that's basically the approach that the UK government took, right? offered us an array of potential solutions to coronavirus on the vaccination stage. The UK said, right, we'll spend on the lot. And, some clever Charlie is going to come along one day and say, well, you spent on this one or that one and they didn't get used. To which I think most people in Britain will say, well, I'm very glad that we pressed all the buttons and saw what lighted up, because we got well ahead of most of our contemporaries on the vaccination stage. If there is a route to doing that, if there is a route to spreading the cost, or as people like to say about the NATO cost, sharing the burden, and making that international in scope, I could see that working, actually. So I'm not completely down on it, no.
Daniel, let me come to you. What do you think the lessons have been from COVID from the point of view of international governance and collaboration across borders? And do we need more of it for when the inevitable happens again? I mean, I know we always build structures to fight the last war, but if pandemics are going to be a feature of life more commonly in the future, what are the lessons for our governmental structures that obviously people like us at the IEA tend to be somewhat skeptical of?
I think that the biggest lesson of COVID-19 is that cooperation already exists, and that the reason why in such an incredible threat in terms of health, like a pandemic, we have seen no shortages whatsoever of food and energy supplies, etc., is because there's a tremendous level of cooperation thanks to global trade. I think that the other lesson of COVID-19 is that when governments decide to cooperate in the way, as Alex was mentioning now, in the way in which the European Union decided to cooperate, the effectiveness is absolutely atrocious. Is that the result is dreadful, because bureaucracy takes over. And I think that obviously, in terms of intentions, completely agree with Alex, absolutely well-intentioned. Of course, I believe that there's more need for cooperation. What I don't find is that the solution has to come from having more intergovernmental agreements that will actually not improve innovation and disseminate the improvements of technology and the improvements in healthcare all over the world, but actually compartmentalize everything and make it more bureaucratic. I think that is the risk. And again, I come back. The lessons from COVID-19 is that we've had very little economic damage and supply damage because of international cooperation and the very quick response of the private sector in order to manage a very complex situation. But that when governments decide to basically let it all on the hands of one bureaucratic entity, the result is atrocious. So I think that I would be very happy to see the level of cooperation, for example, that we have seen in Asia, in which the leaders in fighting the pandemic, from South Korea to Taiwan to Singapore, etc., have actually been efficient and have been quick in the response, but without adding massive layers of bureaucracy.
I tell you what, Mark, I'll go you one more, because as you two have been talking, I've thought of another potential. I'm not saying this is what they're going to do, and no doubt we're going to see some very statist things emerge, which will not be as we would wish them to be. But I've thought of, as you were talking, another way that it might work and it might be positive. If we think of, let's make it easy for us and put it in a darling of the free market. Let's say that the Estonians have a startup, and this startup has been joined by several leading scientists from that region, and they've identified a few conditions that are very unlikely to come about, but if they did come about, would have terrible effects. They're right up on the Torino scale of an asteroid hitting the Earth and wiping out human life. In medical terms, they're right up the top right-hand corner in red, where you don't want it to be. And they say, well, look, if they ever have to produce it, it would be at cost. So no one's very, very likely to want to invest in it. It's very unlikely to happen anyway, but for the good of humanity, we think we should probably be investing in it, but we don't have the resources to fully do it ourselves. Can you, UK, France, Germany, chip in to ensure that we get this vaccine up to speed and scale so that it's ready to be put into production if that condition were to emerge? That wouldn't be a bad, right? I can see that being a reasonable outcome.
Okay. I can see that. I see that, if I may, I can see that. I see that all of the elements that need for such a situation to actually flourish into a production line and into a success already exist. Is that there's absolutely nothing in the protocols that exists in bilateral agreements between nations that would prevent such a thing from happening, unless you start to create very, very long and very aggressive bureaucratic measures. But again, of course, we agree on all of that. Absolutely.
So then I have another reason. I'm constructing things where, against my own wishes, where this state system might be a good one. The more investment you had from outside parties, let's say the UK or the US or Canada, the less likely a European nation state which had produced something like this or happened to have a factory in it would be able to impose an export ban, right? So actually, when you had these sort of systems, the international system, now they're probably going to hate it, right? But that sort of international system might well ensure that people don't start vaccine protectionism.
That's a great point. That is actually probably the best, actually, that one gets to defend this idea. Absolutely.
But come on, gents, I want to get you back onto the libertarian side of the fence. We're not central planners who've got sort of some. Alex is starting to wax lyrical about all of his great ideas for new government institutions that could do A, B, and C. Let me tell you, my worry is that we should objectively look at the successes and the failures of dealing with COVID-19. But nearly always where there's governmental failure, the lessons that politicians draw is we need more government, better funded government, more schemes and the rest of it. Isn't the standout lesson of this that we should, Daniel, scrap the World Health Organization in its present form? I mean, it has been a disgrace, the World Health Organization. It seems to have been influenced by China quite heavily, but gave out the wrong information at the wrong time, was well behind the game. I mean, it wouldn't actually say, right, we've got to learn the lessons from this. There needs to be more international cooperation. The World Health Organization has been found catastrophically wanting. Let's scrap that and set up something completely different.
Or not set up an organization that politically decides on such important matters. At the end of the day, the problem of these multinational entities is that they inevitably, even if you scrap this one and start another one, they inevitably will become politically driven. Therefore, what you need to have is, at the end of the day, it all comes down to what matters, which is independent bodies that have absolutely nothing to do with governments. Therefore, the lesson from this pandemic should actually be that all of the measures that we're talking about, the further away they are from governments implementing them or leading them, the better. The governments can actually participate, but they should not be the ones driving it, for a very simple reason. Inevitably, at the end of the process, there will be either problems of transparency or problems of bureaucracy, or both.
Alex, don't you think that the other lesson that we could draw, I really hope this lesson is drawn, is what we've learned about the vaccines, and hats off to the people who've been able to develop them. I mean, it bamboozles me the miracle of science. But of course, we fast-tracked the regulatory sign-off, right? Had this been a normal drug and COVID had not been a top story, this would have taken years to have got to market.
Yes.
Do you think a lesson we're going to draw from this is, well, okay, well, this was fast-tracked because it's, all over the world and many people are dying, but we should apply the same philosophy to experimental drugs to, I don't know, deal with cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever? That seems to me one of the standout examples here of actually retreating a bit from the precautionary principle and saying, look, we on the balance of risk, we've got to get this vaccine to market ASAP. We can't wait 5 years while we treble test it on, 1,000 different blind tests. Do you think that lesson's going to be drawn, or are we going to be back in the slow lane as far as pharmaceutical regulation is concerned?
I fear it will be back to the slow lane, but I hope we learn the lesson in the way that you have described. The precautionary principle has underpinned the European Union's approach to this, and we've seen what it's done to vaccines as a result. To be clear, we struggle in normal times to get permission to use experimental drugs, even on patients who sadly have terminal conditions, even on people who volunteer, who willingly say, I would love to help those who are to come. And who knows, in a miracle, it might even help me, even though I've been given a terminal diagnosis. And Western democracies struggle to give permission to allow experiments to be undertaken by those people who volunteer because their lives are going to be so foreshortened by the horrible conditions they have and they want to help. So I would hope that we could go that little bit. But I would hope furthermore that the big lesson we might take from this is that people suffer from a delay from a drug coming to market, not only during a pandemic, but in normal times. People suffer year on year with conditions that might be treated by drugs that are in process and being tested, but are not and are stymied by a slow process of permissions. This is not to say that I want a Wild West bonanza in which drug is invented today and given to everybody tomorrow, but it is certainly to say that I think we can do better than we do currently. And that must be a salutary lesson, A, of the procedures that we've undergone so far, and B, of the falsity of the precautionary principle that we use, that we've been using. Wolfgang Munchau put it well in The Spectator, I thought, when he said that it's a very reckless caution you're using when hundreds of people are dying in the course of you taking your cautious approach.
Very interesting. Tom Burrows makes a good point in the chat. Daniel, perhaps I can put this to you before we bring in our next guest to join us. Tom says, when this is all over, is it worth asking policymakers what their plan B was, if at all, had no workable vaccine ever been invented, right? I mean, we're now celebrating the miracle of it, and so many people have got to it at the same time. But supposing that had not happened, we lock down the world economy forever? I mean, that surely needs to be part and parcel of considering future responses. You can imagine a pandemic in the future where, unfortunately, scientists are not able to unlock a vaccine or a cure, right?
It's a great question, because there was never a plan B. There has never been a plan B, and no policymaker can tell you, oh, our other option was X, because it wasn't. The only option was lockdown and wait and see. Thankfully, I would say to our friend, never bet against human ingenuity. Is that one thing that this pandemic has shown us is how rapidly the private sector and the world of science gets to work efficiently and delivers in absolutely record time. But to go to policymakers and say, look, what is the plan B in an environment or in a situation in which there is no response from science? There is no plan B.
Well, hang on. I agree with your point about not underestimating ingenuity and creativity. I disagree that there was no possible or potential, or in some places used plan B. It's just wildly unpopular now. It was called herd immunity. And people, shudder and run away from that idea. And the Swedes gave it a go and it didn't work out for them. And the UK policy environment flirted with it before denying that it ever did. But in the absence of a vaccine, surely I'm afraid that would have been the plan B that countries around the world would have explored. It just turned out to be a great deal more costly in human life than people might ever have expected. And a vaccine was produced more swiftly than we might have otherwise realistically have believed.
Well, gentlemen, let me bring in our next guest as well to hear her thoughts on this. Claire Fox, or to give her a proper title, Baroness Fox of Buckley, the founder of the absolutely brilliant Academy of Ideas. Claire, it's absolutely great to have you with us. Thanks for being back on the show. Lovely to see you. We need to take you off mute, or you're off mute. That's brilliant. Claire, you were a big Brexiteer, elected successfully on the Brexit Party ticket for the last ever Euro elections in Britain. What do you make of this international cooperation needs to be bigger and better in order to combat future problems like COVID-19 in future? As somebody who fought for Britain's independence, do you think this is the sort of thing, these sort of potential risks, where actually there is a role for international cooperation, international institutions, rather than national sovereignty, Claire?
Well, national sovereignty was never against international cooperation. It was against enforced signing up to an institutional rules-based system from the top with no democratic accountability. So as a Brexiteer, I've always been an internationalist. It's a myth that national sovereignty was some kind of little England, never look to your friends. And actually, we've seen the kind of protectionism that people might have tried to smear Brexiteers with, actually more associated with an international institution, the EU. They're the ones who have been lacking in international generosity in any way. So it would be wrong. I mean, it's the flexibility of national sovereignty. And actually, that's really what's been exposed, isn't it? That the EU has just incapable as an institution of a kind of swift, flexible, creative reaction, because it's kind of like this sort of juggernaut that has to drag everybody with it, but it doesn't really drag them. And the precautionary principle is institutionalized within it. I've heard you discussing that. And the precautionary principle has always been a very backward-looking way of approaching problem solving. And although I have to say that we've had a fair amount of the precautionary principle in the UK in the international response to COVID, so I don't want to just say it's them, but they've got it so embedded that they wouldn't sign the contracts for the drugs in time because they were so busy jumping through all these hoops and all these kind of we've got to tick this box and that. And it was almost as though they imagined that the world would stop and then they go, okay, we agree with you. Now here you are. And they missed the boat, right? Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I think Alex reflected on, what you've just been reflecting on, that's very important, is international scientific collaboration, which was, it drove me mad standing as for Brexit when people would say to me, what will happen to science when we can't collaborate internationally, as though there was no such thing as scientific collaboration unless the EU sat on top of it and okayed it. But actually what we have seen is incredible international collaboration over the manufacture, over the discovery of, and then the manufacture of, and the making of all the different vaccines we're seeing coming into line, not just AstraZeneca, but all of them have required a cross-border collaboration. Never something I was opposed to. Always a good idea. Didn't need the EU's approval. And that's why the EU don't understand. They keep going, there are drugs, they were made here, because they think that's what it happens. Well, it's got nothing to do with them. They're an institution from top down. Anyway, so that's my immediate response to some of the things you've been talking about.
So I want to stick on the theme of public health, but to move from the sublime invention and rollout of vaccines to the ridiculous end of the public health spectrum, I think I'd call it. The new Office for Health Promotion was launched earlier this week, aiming to ease the pressure on the NHS and to slim down the nation's waistline, basically through government fiat. The reason I think this ties into the whole COVID-19 debate was, Public Health England, in Chris Snowdon's words and many others, had one job, to really look after public health. And rather than concerning themselves with the possibility of an infection from China or how we would cope with the pandemic, they seem to spend an awful lot of their time making sure that we, can't advertise hamburgers before the watershed, or fast food restaurants, and you shouldn't be too close to schools, or warning labels on fizzy drinks, or a sugar tax, or all of the rest of it. Alex, let me start with you on this new agency. In the Telegraph earlier this week, Chris Snowdon actually was quietly optimistic about this new agency because it won't have autonomy. It will sit within the Department of Health and Social Care. So he thinks it won't be able to act as a kind of pressure group in the way that Public Health England, you could argue, potentially has. But what do you make of it? Are we right to split the kind of what we would call nanny stating, paternalistic, don't eat too many sticky buns, don't smoke and drink too much, as I say, as I lift my beer to my lips. Are we right to have that in one agency and then really let Public Health England focus on, what would we do if there was an Ebola outbreak or some ghastly virus in the future? Is that the correct division, the right way of looking at these two problems?
Unambiguously, yes, it should be separated out because it makes it clear which agency is responsible for proper healthcare seeking to deal with pandemics and epidemics and so forth. Whether they succeed or fail is another question, but it makes it clear who's responsible. And a second agency is responsible for the nanny state paternalism that we might want to disagree with. At the moment, having them amalgamated together means that they can play bait and switch. And when you attack one, they can hide behind the other. You're no good at dealing with a pandemic. Oh, yes, but we're very good at encouraging people to walk. You're no good at shrinking the national waistline. Oh, yes, but look at how well we got the vaccine rollout done. So it's actually very good to have agencies split into this so you can see who's responsible for what. That said, it's obviously terrible. And I say that because in any free society, there are always going to be an exceptionally small group of people who don't have mental capacity to make choices for themselves. And that sad group of individuals, we've all got a societal duty to look after, and that genuinely is a duty of the state and their families, probably in reverse order to the one in which I said it. But for the rest of society, the number of people in any free society who are fat correlates exceptionally closely to the number of people who have chosen to be fat. We know that hamburgers are bad for us if we eat them all the time. We know they can be perfectly fine for us as part of a balanced diet. Nobody thinks that going down the sweet shop and having bars of chocolate is part of your health food. It's patronizing nonsense to suggest that we need the state to nudge us or help us or suggest to us. We know these things already. And my point is that in a free society, these are choices that we make. I've got a bit of a spare tire because I like food, I like to drink, and I don't like to exercise very much. And that's down to me, isn't it? And the suggestion that it's actually the state's fault and the state should become my parent instead of an organization that reports to me as a customer of it, somewhat reluctantly sometimes, it seems to me to be for the birds.
I've put on a lot of weight since I gave up smoking. I might have to seriously consider taking up the cigarettes again, I think, just to fight my waistline. Daniel, perhaps I'll come to you on this. Haven't we basically seen typical, predictable, albeit hugely disappointing mission creep in public health? Public health is now used to describe the health of the public. That's not really what it should mean. Public health should be, risk of the water supply being poisoned or a pandemic like COVID. Smoking, drinking, eating too many hamburgers, and I bet you I'm beating Alex on that, but that's a private health issue, right? That's a private matter for Alex and his waistline and me and my waistline. Public health seems to have morphed into just talking about the health of the public rather than actually a collective action problem. Is that right?
It is, absolutely it is. And the problem again comes from the very thin line between being transparent and providing enough information so that individuals make the right choices to nudging, even imposing. And it comes back to this constant regurgitation of social engineering that we hear all the time. And what one just does not understand is why is there going to be a much better outcome for the population if you have a governmental body basically just saying using taxation for their ideas. But the point is that you don't achieve a better result by getting that to that level of interference in private lives. What you need to do is to provide education, transparency, information, so that individuals make the right choices. There has never been in history more availability of healthy food, of healthy habits, of the possibility of taking the measures that we require in order to be better in our day-to-day lives. So what are they going to do? Are they going to basically just generate a governmental body that is going to tell us what we can and cannot do when we have exactly all of the information and we know precisely the risks that we're taking? It's not like, we were 60 years ago and we really didn't know what kind of impact certain foods or certain products had on your health. Today, you have an absolutely incredible amount of information, and what we need to do is improve the level of education so that individuals make the right choices for themselves.
Claire, let me come back to you, because it seems even if we in Britain are sort of patting ourselves on the back for rolling out vaccines much more quickly than the European Union, the nanny state, I won't say it's a peculiarly British phenomenon, but whenever at the IEA we look into how many restrictions and bans and prohibitions and regulations there are around smoking, drinking, fast food or whatever, the UK comes up pretty high up the table in terms of being a nanny state country compared to the rest of the European Union even. Claire, what do you think is behind this? Is it really a concern about public health? Is there some sort of, you could argue there's some sort of class warfare going on, that actually quite a lot of working class habits, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, frowned upon by the kind of metropolitan elite. But why are we so peculiarly bad at this in the UK? In a lot of areas, we're pretty good on freedom issues, at least relatively to other countries, but not in this space at all. Am I right?
I think you're right. I'm not sure I entirely understand it, but one of the things that happened was there was a great disillusion from the Labour Party in particular with how useless the working class was, because they wouldn't vote for them or they weren't, radical enough, and a kind of disillusion that they're sort of, if left to their own devices, the working class would never make their own minds up. So that kind of like Labour paternalism coincided with not a strong attachment to freedom from the UK, the right in the United Kingdom, which basically freedom was a kind of second order issue, for some more important than others. And those two things coming together just meant that long before we had a pandemic, I mean, you've got to remember that Public Health England has spent the last 2 decades telling us that we were about to go under because of a pandemic, but it was a pandemic of binge drinking or a pandemic of junk food or a pandemic created by obesity. I mean, I remember tracking all the terms that they used in terms of viral pandemics, and it was like this sort of a pandemic of bullying, by the way, a pandemic of everything was a pandemic. Then suddenly there's a pandemic and everyone goes, oh, what do we do now? But what they could always rely on, and I suppose what's been most disappointing in this period has been that their natural instinct is to assume you can't trust people. And we've seen that writ large, and to decommission people. Now, the reason why this matters is because, when we were talking about the great aspect of human ingenuity as expressed in scientific or medical research that brought the vaccines to us once you removed all the barriers. And by the way, God, why doesn't the government just say that's the lesson we've learned? Oh, good, let's make things come to market quicker. Let's go. But oh no, what have they learned? They've learned that we've got to put health as an outcome for individuals as a virtue into the heart of government, with safety and good health there. And they've decommissioned people, but you could have just as creative a reaction to dealing with a pandemic that's non-scientific. I mean, we were saying herd immunity or vaccine, but there were also other things that if you'd have only trusted people, you could have come up with all sorts of things that would have meant that, for example, we could have solved problems about how we dealt with care homes or how we dealt with some of the awful things that we've had to deal with in the last year. And they never do that, do they? So just in terms of this new agency, one good thing is that it's in the Department of Health. The reason why that's good is because it's now more accountable, and they can't blame Public Health England as though they are a separate organisation, which we always knew they weren't. But the bad thing is, it's, for me, the institutionalisation of this idea that our health is the most important thing about us, that the government's main role in life is to protect us from ourselves so that we don't get unhealthy. And it's not even just a question of saying, well, I'd rather, have a pie and a pint and a cigarette, if that's what I want to do. There just are more important things for lots of us than our own physical being, right? We have in the past, historically, I mean, humanity believed in things beyond self-obsession. You know, oh my God, how long am I going to live for? You know, we think that some things matter more, and they have turned this into, I mean, you know, it's cliche to say the new religion, but this new department, I'm afraid, is making that lifestyle obsession with fear that if you don't follow the instructions, you will die, part of everyday life. So you get over coronavirus, but you don't get over the obsession with the fact that your health is at risk from whatever they describe as a pandemic next.
Daniel, before I let you go, let me come back to you. I'd welcome your thoughts on this. I mean, what do we need to do to get back to a basic position of personal responsibility? You know, if I put on too much weight because I've eaten too many hamburgers, or I've got a headache because I've drunk too much beer, that's on me, isn't it? Why is this an issue for the government? And as Claire was pointing out, they're often presenting it as if it's a kind of collective action problem, you know, an obesity pandemic, as if it's contagious, if I drink too much and eat too many hamburgers, you get fat. What do we need to do to try and get this back to, you know, these products might not be good for you. They could certainly be very bad for you if you overconsume them, but it's on you.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that we need to do is to understand that it's not the job of the state to engineer how citizens are and how each person behaves. And even if they want to, they're not going to achieve it. The second thing that we need to do is to provide, as by the way, and my children have been educated in the United Kingdom, and all of the in their classes day to day with their teachers, etc., and that has been a driving factor for their own personal choice. But ultimately, it is always going to be a personal choice. The idea that all of the health problems of a society come from the fact that human beings are evil and they misbehave against themselves is very Gramscian, as from Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist intellectual. Is very, oh, they don't know what to do with themselves. Let us tell them what to do with themselves. But it ultimately, first, obviously, it always fails. Secondly, and more importantly, is that the only way in which a society progresses is when individuals collectively but freely decide to go down a path that is ultimately better for themselves. And the reality is that despite all these ideas about obesity, pandemics, etc., the reality is that the availability of healthy options is unprecedented, and that what you need is education and freedom. And obviously, there will always be somebody that decides to misbehave, but that is their personal choice.
Alex, before I let you go as well, what are your thoughts on this? How do we win this back? Because it seems to me this is just, we've been on this sort of slippery slope. You know, it starts with tobacco, then alcohol and sugar, and you know, God knows what's next. You know, we'll have a kind of standard legalized bedtime or something in order to improve our health. Why is it all drifting in this direction, and what's needed to get back a sense of personal responsibility being at the root of what you actually decide for your own health? And as Claire says, there are trade-offs here. You might do things that you enjoy or like, but that aren't necessarily great for your health, might be very injurious to your health, but still have meaning and benefit to you.
It seems that policymakers now view everything through one of two lenses. Either it's something they should be paternalist about, like we're discussing, or it's something we're all racist about. We need to be controlled on racism. Only in this past month, I've seen that skiing is racist and gardening is racist. So it's either racist or fattening, and government has to intervene, must be the answer. Both of my fellow panelists have talked about the left, and, you know, I think they're onto something, actually. And Claire was asking why, she couldn't think of why this has happened in the UK Labour Party, but it has. I agree that it's happened, and I suggest that the cause of it, broadly speaking, is a generational change in leadership. And you see that on many issues. You see it in Euroscepticism, which used to be the mainstream position on the left and had been beaten out of it by these bien-pensant metropolitan lefties, to the point that in our referendum on leaving the European Union, you basically never heard the left-wing case for leaving the EU, which, by the way, is that it was a corporatist stitch-up done in the interest of big businesses and big banks. And, you know, I'm not a man of the left, but distance lends perspective. And, you know, they weren't completely wrong. But that same generational shift happened in this paternalist environment. And some of the old grizzled warriors of the Blair cabinet, you know, the John Reeds of this world, who would say we shouldn't raise taxes on alcohol or tobacco because the working man deserves at the end of a hard day's strife to have a pint and a fag. And that is, it's just impossible to imagine the Labour leadership saying things like that now. That's relatively recent. And so in answer to your question, I think that the left has got to reclaim this small L liberalism, because there are still people in Parliament and around the Labour Party who say things like that about Euroscepticism, who say that about working class pleasures and pursuits and not stamping on the working man. But none of them are in leadership anymore. They're around the fringes of that party. And if we're going to have a proper cross-party debate about what it means to be free and liberal in society, the left has got to rediscover what was once part of its quintessential essence.
Brilliant point. Wish you good night on, Alex. Lovely to have you back on the show. Alex, Daniel, thank you so much for being with us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Claire, please stay with us. We're going to bring in a couple of new guests now. We're going to continue to consider regulation and the reach of the state. Absolutely delighted to have back on the show Joanna Williams, journalist, commentator, founder of the CIEO think tank. Joanna, good evening. How are you? Lovely to see you.
Hello, great, thank you.
And from IEA Home Team, our head of regulatory affairs here, Victoria Hewson. Good evening, Victoria. Lovely to have you with us.
Hi, Mark.
So I want to consider runaway red tape in general, the overall state of regulation. I want to narrow it down to this controversial issue of vaccine passports. But let's start big picture, 30,000 feet. Victoria, in your IA research paper, Rules Britannia, you reckoned that the regulation cost, the cost of regulation to the British economy was about £220 billion a year, a bit north of 10% of overall GDP. It's just the cost of regulation. How did you get to that figure? And should we consider that scarily too high? Or some of these regulations actually have benefits to us?
Well, I'm not going to claim the credit for actually having calculated that figure. That was actually an estimate that was put together by one of the government's own better regulation initiatives from a few years ago. But the calculation itself is very, very hard to do, because a failure that actually government departments often make themselves when they're doing cost benefit analyses is they only look at the immediate cost of compliance, of having to hire a few extra compliance people or change your paperwork, and they discount the dynamic effects that it has on competition by deterring small firms from entering the market or deterring overseas providers. You know, it can be very protectionist. And those kinds of figures are very, very hard to calculate with any sort of respectable certainty, the sort of dynamic effects, competitive effects in the economy. And that 200 billion figure is a sort of reasonably respectable estimate. But I would say, you know, given since that estimate was published, we've had waves of extra regulation, like things like the GDPR have come in, that the literature and the research shows has had really serious implications for investment and innovation, and has massively, entrenched further the positions of the big tech companies who actually quite like regulations like the GDPR, because it gives them even more of an edge against smaller competitors. So I would say, if anything, we're going to be way past that figure, which is from about 10 years ago now.
Wow. Joanna, isn't this part of the answer to what people call the productivity puzzle? You know, why is productivity sort of so disappointingly low in the UK and the West as a whole? Is it because we're spending all of our lives going around complying rather than producing? So that's a big chunk of everybody's life now, making sure you're abiding by all of the rules. I'm not suggesting you can throw the entire rule book out, but the rule book seems to get longer, more complicated, more impenetrable with each passing day, and it strangles innovation and enterprise, doesn't it?
Well, I guess one positive way of looking at this, given the figures Victoria's just quoted to us, is that clearly all this regulation and bureaucracy is keeping an awful lot of people in work at the moment and giving people a job to do. It certainly sounds as if a large part of the entire UK economy seems to be driven by people monitoring and regulating and imposing rules on one another. And I guess what worries me is perhaps slightly less the cost of all of this to the taxpayer, although I'm sure from what Victoria says, I mean, that's an incredible amount of money, but more the impact that this has on all of our lives. And the problem is it seems to stretch very readily from regulation and rules in the business sphere to petty regulations about things like children's playgrounds and when and where you can walk in a park and where you can sit. And I mean, we've seen this go into massive amounts of overdrive over the course of this past year. And I suspect the government wouldn't have been quite so successful in imposing lockdown restrictions if the groundwork perhaps hadn't already been put in place with this regulation and bureaucracy and our ready acceptance of so much of this, it seems, in this country.
Claire, I'm becoming more and more gammony with every year, and I'm becoming a bit of a barroom bore. Things were much better when I were a lad, but we were talking about the nanny state earlier. I mean, that's part and parcel of this just growth and growth and growth of the regulatory state, right? I mean, just the sheer number and complexity of rules that you're expected to abide by just goes relentlessly upwards. I mean, is there any end in sight for this? Or is it actually probably the case that you get the kind of amount of government you could afford? So if the societies get richer, the number of rules and regulators sort of grow in tandem with that. But it's absolutely eye-watering, the increase in red tape and rules and compliance in virtually every area of our lives. No, Claire? And is there any way to put this ratchet into reverse?
Well, we talked in the earlier part of the discussion about how one of the problems is that cross-party, or the whole of political culture, just doesn't trust the individual decision-making and judgment of millions of its citizens. And as a consequence, those rules become necessary, because if you don't trust them, you have to have them follow rules. It's also the case that I think that the political elite, I can't think of another phrase, I know that it sounds a bit hackneyed, but they also don't trust their own project, it seems to me. Even the concept of trust, you say, let's have trust. Let's have a code of conduct of trust. Let's have rules to prove that you're trustworthy. So even something like trust, it seems to me to completely undercut trust if you have to tick boxes in order to prove you're trustworthy. And any virtues that you can possibly imagine now have to be exhibited through a box ticking exercise. So there isn't a commitment to big ideas. And the only thing anyone can think about is to write it down and check it. I think that's really problematic. So I'm not very hopeful. Also, something else has happened. The Manifesto Club, Josie Appleton, did some great work on this. But, I don't think I understood the significance of what she did when she was looking at the introduction of these kind of, what were they, notices and orders, the use of these civil powers that were given out to local governments on different behaviours, don't drop litter, don't feed the birds, don't do this. And we all kind of thought it was important. We understood somehow that what they did, but what's happened in that is that they've managed to criminalize different aspects of behavior and make them almost semi-illegal. And actually you can be found guilty of a crime if you break, you go from an order, a notice to an order to then. And in the domestic abuse bill, which I have to say that I've just spent so many months of my life in. I've never been a legislator, so I'm a bit obsessed with. I noticed them saying, you know, they brought in these domestic abuse notices that are very easy to get. Then that can become turned into a domestic abuse order, and then that can be a criminal offence if a police person says so without ever going to court. So you can be criminalised. The thing that you have to understand is that this, you think domestic abuse, you think somebody's getting their head kicked in, right? But no, this can be psychological abuse. This can be all manner of, and breaching a public a domestic abuse order could be the breach of it would be the criminal offence. So the reason I'm saying that is when we talk about regulation, it's even worse than kind of in the business sector. It's just across society, that whole thing. Final quick thing. I really believed, I was silly, that when you left the European Union, obviously a straightforward thing was that you had to bring into domestic law all of the laws that you had in the EU. That's fair enough. I understand that. They weren't going to just... But we would then have democratic control, wouldn't we, of over all those rules. Anyway, I went into a debate in the Lords quite early on. I've only been there 6 months, but I feel old now. But I went quite early on, and I speaking about GDPR, you see, and they were re-establishing GDPR in UK law. And I said, well, I know we have to do this, but I hope the minister takes the opportunity to notice that GDPR rules are absolutely rubbish. You know, they've been completely hopeless. They've ruined small businesses. They're not about, I said all this. And everyone laughed in the room. And it was really embarrassing. And then the minister said, oh, can I just assure Baroness Fox, we have absolutely no intention of reviewing GDPR law now that it's brought home. In fact, we wish to tighten it up. And it was like that. I thought, well, great. Democratic accountability for a law which was decided in the EU. Most of the people in the room, by the way, were British lords who'd written the GDPR law for the EU. But now we were bringing it out. But anyway, in other words, there's not even an instinct amongst legislators, not even a smidgen of an instinct to tear up any rule or law. And that's our biggest problem.
Claire, don't. This is my biggest nightmare, that Brussels bureaucrats are bad, but Whitehall bureaucrats are worse, right? That's the problem. Victoria, we published at the IEA today your new report. You're our head of regulatory affairs, so you've definitely got a job for life, right? That's not going to go away anytime soon. Who regulates the regulators? You were looking at the financial ombudsman, and you found, I'm quoting you here, that it has failed to deliver on its primary objective of providing fair and reasonable resolutions of disputes. What are your wackiest, weirdest examples of some of the decisions that the financial ombudsman have taken?
So I think it's fair to say, first of all, it's failing in its sort of objective of providing a fast, efficient dispute resolution service for consumers, because there is a backlog of tens of thousands of people waiting more than a year to get their case solved, which is a fairly fundamental sort of operational problem. But in terms of how it affects the regulatory environment that firms and consumers are operating in, there's one example that was very high profile because it went all the way through the courts, of this guy who wanted to invest his pension into a sort of green investment scheme in emerging markets. And you have to engage a specialist pensions provider to do that. So he asked them to transfer his savings into this fund for him. And they say, have you taken advice on this? He says, no, this is definitely what I want to do. Will you just please do it? And they say, oh, well, you really should take advice. We recommend you take advice, but okay, sign here to say you've been offered advice, you don't want it, and you just want to proceed with executing this transaction. So they do it. The funds are transferred. Turns out, unsurprisingly, perhaps to some, the fund turned out to be a bit of a dud, and he lost all of his savings. He then said it wasn't fair, and that this pensions provider should have done the due diligence on the investment that he had told them to conduct on his behalf, even though that would have meant, in this case, investigating title to properties in Cambodia. And he expected them to have done all that on an execution-only fee. So, he had in no way paid for that kind of service. The Financial Ombudsman Service agreed with him that this was unfair and that he should be compensated by this pensions service provider. Now, what this ultimately means, this guy's lucky. He gets to have made a very bad decision, and he gets bailed out of his bad decision by the Ombudsman. What it means for firms and what it means for the rest of the consumers is that firms just simply won't provide that kind of service anymore. Yeah. Why would you provide an execution-only service at a basic price when you have to take on all the risk, as if you had sent a crack team of analysts to Cambodia to investigate title and all of this? So ultimately, the rest of the market all lose out, because this actually completely unaccountable. They're not even really a regulator. They're an ombudsman service. They're a sort of, they're actually a limited company, made this decision that had these very strong knock-on effects across the whole market, purely because they decided that that was fair.
Yeah.
And that was what the regulatory structure as they saw it demanded. And there are, so many examples throughout where firms simply can't rely on the contracts that they've entered into. Even if the contracts are clear and not misleading, the Ombudsman will look at this overriding idea of fairness and did the consumer suffer detriment? So it makes it a very hard market for small firms, especially, to operate in.
It's extraordinary. Joanna, I think was it Bastiat who said that democracy is the myth by which everybody lives at everybody else's expense. The regulatory burden of the anecdote that Victoria's just given us here is that sort of any misfortune to you, somebody else needs to be blamed for. You want to shuffle the responsibility of a bad investment off your shoulders. It's got to be the fault of the firm who did the investment by not checking out this place in Cambodia or whatever. And so these sort of regulations just eat away at personal responsibility, right? In fact, you're heavily incentivized to be a victim.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, you made the point earlier, Mark, that kind of some regulation is clearly necessary, and you'd have to be a fool to disagree with you on that. But I think the problem is when we have such a absolute avalanche of regulation and bureaucracy to have to deal with, we lose the capacity to differentiate between which regulation is necessary and which regulation is surplus to requirement, is not necessary. And I think you're absolutely right. At worst, the avalanche of regulation becomes an opportunity for people to abdicate responsibility. And to me, the tragedy where we see this most acutely is in something like the Grenfell Tower fire, where you have layer upon layer of bureaucratic regulation that building suppliers, fire regulators, health and safety officials, landlords, et cetera, we're all supposed to comply with. But rather than that bureaucracy actually helping to keep the people who lived in that building safe, it became one opportunity after another for everyone to pass the buck on to somebody else, as somebody else was responsible, somebody else was to blame. And ultimately, a few very commonsensical things that could have been done to protect the people in that building were not done because everybody had an excuse to shift responsibility onto someone else.
So here's another regulation that might come in. I'm going to have to play devil's advocate, I suspect, here, because I'm just guessing, I think I know what the responses of my three guests are going to be here. Vaccine passports, but, new rules allowing, you've got to wave this piece of paper or more likely a rather sophisticated QR code in order to be served in a pub to prove, I don't know, that you've been vaccinated, perhaps had your second jab or have got the antibodies or some such like. Claire, what should freedom lovers make of this idea? I'll be completely honest here, it's divided the IEA. Some people are saying, oh, this is Big Brother, surveillance gone mad, outrageous discrimination. Others have said, it's a private property decision. I mean, landlords can turn you away for any number of reasons. If they wish to turn you away because you can't provide a proof that you are not carrying COVID, that's one reason why you might not be allowed into the Dog and Duck. They could have other rules as well. I'm a member of a club in Pall Mall. It used to have a rule that you couldn't get in as a bloke unless you were wearing a tie. That was a private decision. Should we be seeing, Claire, the vaccine passport things as, facilitating the right of a private property owner to decide who comes and goes, or should we see this as an infringement on civil liberties?
So I'm very wary of the hyperbole around vaccine passports, as they're known, or freedom passes, because I do think you can kind of, this kind of idea of the kind of fascist state and you can't do anything and all that, I don't think helps us. Let's put it that way. But even the notion of a freedom pass relates back to what we've just been talking about in terms of regulation, which is what worries me is not the specifics of it, but this idea that you need a permit to be free. There's a broader kind of cultural lesson that comes out of this. So, if a pub wanted to say, you have to show that you've been tested or you have to show you've had a vaccination, you could say, well, that doesn't really matter. But what is the lesson here? The lesson is that you have to have conformed to this safety measure in order to get your freedom to do this. And I think that's not confined to just going for a pub and showing you've had a vaccine. I think it's a bit more deeply embedded than that. The other thing is that I was involved in a discussion with Chris Snowden earlier, and he was rightly pointing out how ridiculously impractical it's going to be, and I think it is. How many vaccines? What about the booster? Does one vaccine count more than others? What do you do if you want to take your son and daughter out for a drink and they can't get in and they're only 21? Are you going to say wait for the next 5 years or 5 months? Or what I mean? It's sort of like all a bit mad. But you see, the reason why it fits in with your regulation question, Mark, is because and your colleagues who say, well, there's always a kind of fetishization of, oh, it's a private company, they can do what they want. It's not that draconian. That's a kind of IEA weakness, I would suggest, that, kind of freedom can be eaten into by private enterprise, let me tell you. And woke corporations are just a good example of that. In this instance, it's fearful corporations because they're not using their judgment to decide what to do that's best for their private enterprise. They're panicking. And they're trying to watch their back. They're trying to kind of get a reputational boost as super safe in order to do business. But that's not the same as having the freedom to choose that you want to exclude somebody because of this. It's that they're actually going along with a climate that says, if you don't, you're irresponsible. And we've seen that with every single green measure. That's what all those businesses did when they thought we'd better bring in sustainability advisors. And they turned from one to whole departments that suddenly then started saying, don't pretend you don't you're not an oil company. And then say, oh, maybe we shouldn't be an oil company. I mean, it's kind of a virtuous thing that eats away at the core point of being a private enterprise, which is to make decisions about what you can do. Yeah. And this is a government, it's not the government's mandated. I think they might even say it's voluntary. But if the government tell you that you are free to introduce them or not, but you should always put the health and safety of your customers at the number one priority of everything you do. And the next thing you know, the pubs will be thinking, well, we'll check on their vaccines, but now we need to check if they're drinking too much. Because after all, alcohol's not good for your health either. So back we go to the health as outcome. And the next thing they'll be going around saying, we want you to prove you're not an alcoholic before you're allowed in. We want to prove you're not a binge drinker before you come in, et cetera, et cetera. It's hopeless.
I think that's a really interesting challenge for us IEA types, Claire, about the kind of woke corporate cultural behaviour. I can remember a few years ago, I had a storming row with a leading petrol company when one of them said, our top priority is safety. So I said, well, in that case, stop drilling for oil in the North Sea. I mean, that would be a lot safer to not have an oil rig and not drill for oil, right? If it really is your top priority, shut it down. I thought your top priority was getting oil out of the ground in order that it can, we can, power motor cars and the rest of it. Victoria, what's your take on this as an IEA type? That, I mean, on the one hand, a lot of IEA people are saying to me, it is a private property argument. You can exclude people from the Reform Club on Pall Mall for not wearing a tie. You could exclude people for all sorts of reasons. Isn't this just giving a right to a private property owner to decide who they let in or not?
No, I think that's quite, with respect to the IEA supporters of the idea, a slightly naive way of looking at it, because it's not only the sort of soft government pressure that Claire was just talking about, which is definitely there from public health messaging, etc. But the way the government is currently talking about this is that they might call it voluntary, but if you say that you have to do this if you want to open your small pub, or your small cafe or your nightclub, then that's not really voluntary at all. If opening your business is conditional on checking people's vaccine passport at the door, that's not voluntary. That's not a free market measure. Now, I think there's potentially a debate to be had. There's certainly actually a debate to be had about whether the government should repeal those aspects of the Equality Law and the GDPR and Data Protection Act that already prevent businesses from doing that kind of discriminatory entry policies. There's a debate to be had on that sort of a general liberalisation, which could be seen as a free market measure. This is not that. This is the government de facto mandating a particular measure in order that for pubs and shops, potentially workplaces, to be allowed to open and operate as they wish. So to the dress code example, this is more like the government saying to a gentleman's club, you don't have to make people wear a tie, but if you don't, you can't open. And I don't think anyone at the IEA or anywhere would defend that as a free market measure.
I should be clear in defending the Reform Club. It's not a gentleman's club. Women are also perfectly entitled to join. I should say that. Joanna, what's your take on this? The private property rights issue, or is this actually an insidious attack on freedom, basically?
Well, the latter. I mean, the thing that surprises me about all of this debate is that it's being sold to us, really, more or less explicitly, as being the way that we get back to normal. And I think we're also ground down after a year of lockdown, that we're all desperate to go back to normal, and things that I know I certainly wouldn't have even contemplated a year ago. Certainly, I'm prepared to accept these restrictions or impositions on my life if it means that I stand some chance of, or we stand some chance of getting back to normal. But the bizarre thing about all of this is, like I say, it's being sold as this is how we get back to normal, but it will be anything but normal. I mean, if you think about times when you go to the pub under normal circumstances, kind of, oh, I wish, how I long for this. But even the very point at which, when would your vaccine passport be checked? A nice evening like today, you might just pull up alongside your friends and take a seat outside a pub. You might get a drink and wander off with it. You know, where does the bouncer stand? You know, do pubs have to employ more bouncers? It's very different if you have your identity, again, like long time since this has happened to me, but to have your identity checked at the bar when you purchase a drink, there's a very clear point at which you're making that financial transaction, and the person behind the bar says, you know, can I see your driving license or your passport? But to actually enter a pub, some pubs don't even have a clear kind of entry and exit point. You wander in and out for a fag or to see friends. You know, this will not be a return to normal as we once knew it. If we accept vaccine passports, we're very much saying that we will never have a return to the old normal. We will be living under new forms of restrictions for a very, very long time to come. And I think that should concern all of us.
About 5 years ago, I was asked to provide my passport ID at the Yankees baseball stadium to buy a Budweiser. I had no idea whether to be appalled or flattered by this. About half an hour later, I went back to the same booth to get another Budweiser, and they didn't ask me for my passport that time. I wondered how badly I'd aged in that particular 30 minutes. They had to ask me on the first but not the second. So I want to move on to just a final topic that I'd welcome your thoughts on, because this is also a topic that has caused a lot of interesting internal discussion at the IEA. The cartoon controversy, the Batley Grammar School row, where a religious education teacher has been suspended after showing pupils an image of the Prophet Mohammed. Claire, what's your take on this? Because again, this is where the IEA sort of, isn't this a private issue for the school or whatever the teacher's employment contract is? If you're doing things that offend people in your class, you probably shouldn't. You should be sanctioned for that. Or is this an egregious attack on freedom of speech, and we're all wandering around, just making sure that we don't offend anybody rather than actually teaching people?
Well, if you didn't do anything that offended people in your class, you might as well just give up being a teacher. I mean, practically every aspect of education is going to offend someone. So just to get that out of the way, if that was the basis on which you judged a school, I think this is the most important story that we've discussed tonight. You know, ultimately, this is about what kind of society we live in. Really, I mean, all of it's been about that, but this is the core of freedom. And I think you don't want, for me, you know, the fact that people could say, well, you know, maybe it's a private decision, misses the sense of what a free society really is, right? So what you have here is a particular group using a heckler's veto, but in the grossest possible sense, to say we object to that happening. In this instance, it's a group of Muslim parents effectively doing a de facto blasphemy law by saying that that particular affront to our religion is enough to mean that we think that teachers should be disciplined. The school is obliged. But what it's really shown us is that nowhere in this country have we seen any leadership backing the teacher. This is less than a year after a teacher in Paris, Samuel Paty, was beheaded for a similar crime of showing offensive pictures. Now, the point about whether, you know, we could all have a very long conversation about, well, if you were in a religious education class, would you show the pictures? Would you not show? This is irrelevant. Teachers are free in a free society to teach the curriculum and illustrate it in a range of different ways. First of all, they're supposed to be free from government interference in that. They're even meant to be free from their head teachers. I mean, you do not have to hand in word for word everything you say when you're a teacher as to what you're going to do, because your job is a communicator of knowledge. And you have to, part of the great joy and challenge of being a teacher is finding imaginative ways to elaborate or think about whether you're teaching physics or religious education or what have you. As it happens, it seems that, just to clarify, that this was actually in a textbook anyway, which has only just come to the fore. So it's not even as though he kind of like went out of his way to kind of be, you know, he didn't. But anyway, it's showing those images would be a good illustration of anything from religious tolerance to the free speech debate. You know, it's perfectly acceptable. You know, it's the kind of thing that would make sense because it has a history and you would do that. But he's gone into hiding. The teachers' unions that have spent all year telling us that the most important thing that they do is keeping their members safe, do not seem to think that safety beyond COVID counts. So safety from a mob, no way, they're silent. Come up with some absolutely pathetic statement today. And I do not think that the politicians have been most strong on this. And I would want us all to consider that this is a hugely important moment for us to show solidarity. And just final thing is, although I want to stress, I'm not trying to suggest that this got nothing to do with Islam, because that would be almost cowardly on my behalf. I don't want to avoid that issue of the problem of extreme fundamentalists associated with Islam as a religion. But it did make me laugh that the activists who were standing outside demanding that this teacher be suspended and all the teachers be suspended, the whole curriculum be reviewed, spent the whole time talking about safeguarding and well-being and safety, psychological safety of the pupils. And I thought, my God, they've all been on a safe spaces courses run by NUS. You know, they didn't get that from the Quran. They got that from contemporary UK society that thinks that free speech is a matter of that can be compromised in the name of safety. And we've just lived through a pandemic in which free speech has been compromised in the name of safety. So guess what?
Claire, let me just press you a little bit on this, because I don't know the specifics of what was shown in the classroom or whatever. What I'm trying to get to the bottom of is whether we think in this instance, on the limited information I had, the teacher did absolutely nothing wrong at all. This shouldn't be a question at all. He shouldn't have been infracted. Nobody should have had a word in his shell like. He should have just been allowed to get on with it and teach religious education in the way he saw fit. Or whether we actually just think the punishment is disproportionate, whether it might have been, a quiet word in his ear saying you're just going to need to be a bit more sensitive when you're discussing these sort of issues. The sort of, I don't know, I guess if a teacher used an expletive in the classroom. You wouldn't necessarily fire them, but you'd probably sort of say, yeah, you know, you've got to tone down your language a little. We can't use the F word in front of 14-year-olds. You know what I mean? So is it the punishment has just been too great, or is it that you're actually saying there was sort of no infraction here at all, and, you know, teachers should be able to, you know, go gangbusters in the classroom, say whatever's on your mind?
Broadly speaking, I'm on the more liberal front side of this, of letting teachers be free. But if you, for example, are the head teacher of a school and you think that in a discussion on something, you know, the teacher decided to show pornography to illustrate a row about Mary Whitehouse and pornography, you might think that this was inappropriate. I understand that, but what you then do is you have a word with the teacher. You know, there are ways of, this is a demonstration outside of school in which they are demanding that it's suspended, in which the head teacher says, oh yes, we'll suspend you. They then say they're going to suspend some other teachers, and they've also said they're going to review every single bit of teaching material. So this isn't a normal situation at all in the way that you describe. So I don't want it to be seen, if it were a discussion in which you were having a rational discussion about what should be taught in a classroom. But this is not what has happened. And it's the sense of entitlement. But the most important thing, which I haven't said the phrase, have I, which is people will not criticise the parents who, by the way, it's some parents. Remember, the pupils brought out a petition in support of the teacher. So, you know, it's not all Muslims. It's not all Muslim parents. It's not all Muslim pupils. It's a group of hardcore activists and parents, right? And if you criticize them, you are accused of being Islamophobic. And when you say, shouldn't you be sensitive, it's sensitive to what? And I wrote I've only written one little book, and in the start of my little book, I tell the story of being invited to speak to a group of sixth formers who were all Muslim. And I was talking about free speech, which is what I was invited to speak about. And I made the mistake of not saying the Prophet Muhammad when I said the word Muhammad. And there was it was a moment of great tension, let's put it this way. And they demanded that I apologize. It was a horrible situation. I refused to apologize. This all went on. There was a standoff. But the expectation of those pupils was that I would not say something that they found offensive, and they were going to do me because I had been offensive. And when I say do me, I mean reputationally do me. And that is bad, because if you get known as a racist bigot, that's not good, right? So people frightened of being called a racist bigot, so they back away from the controversy and avoid having the conversation. And just Putney School, I think a school, I don't know what it's called. Anyway, a group of pupils there are complaining that the head teacher of that school has criticised them for burning a Union Jack, and because he has criticised the school uniform. He's the head teacher. He's told the pupils what the school uniform is. They say it's racism, because they wear hijabs that they don't want to conform to the hijab wearing. The school is happy for them to wear hijabs, but not brightly coloured hijabs. They are saying it's racism, Islamophobia. I mean, as it happens, I'm not sure about the Quran's version on brightly coloured hijabs, by the way, as an aside. But you can see where this leads. It's not just this one school. It's much bigger, much broader, and it's very, very important.
I see William Hill says in the YouTube chat, it's embarrassing how much I love Claire Fox's views. I think you should take that as a compliment, Claire.
I don't know who you are, William Hill, but email me later.
Joanna, what's your take on this? That I mean, I'm definitely the view that the way the teacher's been treated seems to me to be extraordinarily disproportionate. I'm not totally sure I would have had an objection if the headmaster took the teacher to one side and said, look, can you just, we need to be slightly more sensitive about how we portray the Prophet Muhammad in religious education classes. I'm not sure I would object to that. But do you think that that the teacher has potentially done something wrong here? It's just a disproportionate punishment? Or is it are you with Claire as a thin end of the wedge issue here, that, the minute that you do anything, you're a racist, you're a bigot, you've got to be, not merely suspended, sacked, must never work in education again. Is it a disproportionate response, or is actually that nothing went wrong in the first place?
Mm-hmm. No, well, I completely agree with Claire. I think any discussion certainly at this stage, when, I mean, let's keep in mind here, we've got a teacher in hiding, a teacher fearful for his life, a teacher who's lived and worked and served the community his entire life, who has now had to remove himself and his family from that community, potentially never to return. He has children who will presumably now have to change their names, have to start in new schools, his wife likewise. I mean, this is an absolutely major imposition. I mean, let's be completely blunt. If this guy is still alive in 6 months' time, and let's pray to God he is, but it could be fairly miraculous. And for him to still be alive in 6 months' time is going to take major, major upheaval for his entire life turned upside down. So talking about, in some ways, the rights and wrongs of whether he should have done this or not, I think is slightly missing the point. And I think whatever he'd said or done, this is so disproportionate, the price he's paying. But if we're going to go down this line and talk about what he did, I think actually defending teachers' professional judgment at this point in time is a really important thing to do. This wasn't just a case of somebody walking into a classroom and saying, hey kids, I want to show you this offensive cartoon. There was a context to this lesson. There was a theme, there was a scheme of work that had been agreed with other teachers in the school. By all accounts, this was a lesson that had been taught previously and been taught by other teachers at the school. Now, I think the thing that is most shameful about this entire incident and most embarrassing is the way that, unfortunately, I think the head teacher has behaved, to apologise for his teacher, to your first response when you must know that this is a good, loyal, hardworking, much-loved member of staff, and your first response when something like this happens is to apologise for them and to suspend them. I mean, that's such an act of cowardice. It's really shameful. And then you add on to that the cowardice of the teaching unions in not defending their member of staff. I mean, I've just written a piece for the Times today, will be out tomorrow morning, basically arguing that the bottom line is teaching unions should defend their employees. They defend their members when their members are faced with losing their job. That is the absolute fundamental raison d'etre of a trade union. You defend your members' jobs. What's happening with education unions, and this goes beyond schools, this stretches into universities, unions are making support for members conditional upon their members holding the right political views. So they're saying, you have a view that we agree with, and then we will support your job. If you say or do something we don't agree with, you're thrown out. We're not going to defend you. You can be suspended, and we will not be there speaking up for you. Thank God for the pupils who started that petition, because it seems to me the only real source of support that this teacher's getting, certainly public support, is from the pupils at the school. And I think that speaks absolute volumes, not just about the good nature of the pupils, the standing of this teacher in the school and in the community, but it also really highlights the cowardice of other people involved in this situation whose very job should have been to defend this man.
I see Possession Friend in the chat says on this petition started by his pupils is up to 64,000 signatures now, just after, or it was a couple of days ago. Victoria, give me a discordant view here. You're just going to agree with Claire and Joanna, aren't you?
I mean, I basically do. I would say, I am probably on the more conservative end of the spectrum than Claire and Joanna in terms of what I think is right and appropriate to teach in lessons. And I think, even though I am generally quite a free speech fundamentalist, I don't think free speech as such applies within schools, because children, we mentioned things like swearing and pornography. I think it goes without saying that we would have higher expectations of the sort of quality of discourse in a school. Is that a free speech matter? Not really sure. However, it seems just completely clear to me that showing this cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad in a lesson about blasphemy falls well within the bounds of appropriate, necessary even discussion in a religious studies class. And especially if, you know, these children, Muslim children, are growing up in this country, they actually shouldn't be protected from those kinds of debates, because that's really going to be very counterproductive for them and the lives that they're able to live, and obviously for our society too. And going back, I guess, you know, from a legal side of things, reflecting on the vaccine passport thing, it's kind of similar in a way. We've seen some quite wet, appeasing people writing columns this week about how, no, of course we don't have a blasphemy law in this country. I'm sorry, we de facto have a blasphemy law in this country if by committing what in the eyes of one particular faith is considered to be a blasphemy, you will lose your job, lose your reputation, your livelihood, your life, and your family's lives will be threatened. That's a de facto blasphemy law, and it's one that isn't even supported by the normal safeguards of, you know, the rule of law and proper institutions. So it's actually in many ways worse than a blasphemy law.
We need to wrap up, but Claire, let me come back to you. You're a woman of the left. What's happened to the trade union movement? A number of people have mentioned this is, I don't know whether this teacher is a member of a trade union, but you would absolutely expect the NUT or the NASUWT to be all over this like a rash, right? As Joanna said, what's happened? I mean, that's the point of a trade union, is precisely for this sort of eventuality.
I completely go. I mean, I think Joanna described it better than I can, really. I mean, in as much as they've basically been turned into politicizing bodies that basically they do not represent working class people or workers, not working class, workers. In terms of fighting for their jobs, they represent a particular outlook politically, and if you don't conform, I mean, we've already seen. I mean, the Paul Embry example is a classic one. You know, Paul Embry was actually disciplined by his own trade union, of which he was an official, the Fire Brigade Union, because he spoke at a Brexit event, pro-Brexit, and which they said was in his own time.
Starts with Brexit, and before you know it, you're a racist.
Exactly.
Figure, right? Yeah.
That's effectively what they said, right? They made that decision. So in some ways, they're a husk of themselves. But, you know, I can also ask you, what's happened to the so-called libertarian right on this one, right? Where are they? I mean, my problem is the left and right are all hopeless. I mean, if only it were the trade union movement that were the only hopeless people in the game, you know, if only it was only the Labour MP, but, you know, Gavin Williamson has come out and said something. Well, very good. But they should be absolutely full front, absolutely to the fore. And I am hardly a supporter of Macron. Let's be frank, in France, and in relation to the EU and vaccines and all the rest of it, Macron's not my favourite person. But at least the French establishment had the courage, you know, the backbone to say, we are France, we will not have this, right? And they did say that. Where is that conversation going on? Where is that? That there isn't, you know, we can't get Boris Johnson and half the cabinet off the telly. They're having daily press conferences. They should have had a press conference. They should have told every teacher in the country to use that textbook, right? In solidarity, right? That's what I would do. But I mean, so the instincts around the left and the right is to, let's keep it quiet. Let's not stir the boat. Let's not cause any problems. And that is what is known widely as appeasement to a small group of Muslims who do not represent Muslims in general. And I say that again, not just because I'm a lefty who doesn't want to be accused of Islamophobia, but because it's true. How dare they speak on behalf of the Muslim community? This little band of activists. But why do we behave as though that matters? Because we've all bought into identity politics. And at the same time, just let's bear in mind, Gavin Williamson today has announced that it's going to be a widespread inquiry, maybe into this in schools? No. Apparently rape culture is rampant throughout schools. And how does he know that? Because ex-school pupil did a thing, lots of people emailed in, and he thinks this proves there's a national emergency on sexual abuse in schools. There's a national emergency in schools when a school teacher is in hiding for their life in Yorkshire, and he's kind of put out a statement Well, he wants an inquiry into that, doesn't he? Not into this mad, reactive, knee-jerk response on sexual harassment. That'll be me cancelled by everyone.
We've well overrun our time, but we've packed an awful lot in. Where are the freedom lovers of both the right and the left, Claire? On Live with Littlewood at 6 o'clock every Wednesday, right? We may be a small band, but we bring them together right here. Joanna, Claire, Victoria, thank you very much for joining me for a fascinating discussion this evening. My thanks too to Daniel and Alex for joining us earlier on in the show. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that thumbs up icon. That helps on the algorithm. And if you're not yet subscribed, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. We'll be back next week on Live with Littlewood, but we've also got coming up 2 In Conversation events. I'll be in conversation with Arlene Foster, the First Minister of Northern Ireland, next Wednesday. Matthew Saeed will be joining us in conversation on the 13th of April. And Steve Buckley will be joining me on the 26th. And if you can't get enough IEA content, then please join me again at 1 o'clock tomorrow on the IEA London YouTube channel on the topic of Stuck in the Suez. Does this show the fragility of globalization and free trade with Johan Norberg and William Clouston? So please join me again then at 1 o'clock tomorrow. My thanks again to Claire, Joanna and Victoria. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks very much to our donors. Subscribe, thumbs up, notification bell. Have a great evening. Over and out.